Very good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So I would like to brief about, sir. I would like to introduce, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Manmohan R. Kalgal, a renowned teacher in the field of structural engineering. So he has around 20 years of teaching, research, and consultancy experience. He was a professor of civil engineering at MS Ramaya Institute of Technology, Bangalore. Later, he moved on to industry in the year 2003 and worked at different positions in the industry. So he joined Ultratech Cements as head building products division and later took as joint president, head technical services. Presently, he is serving as technical advisor at Ultratech Cements. So his services are recognized in different professional bodies. He is a fellow of several professional bodies like IS Structure E, Associate of Consulting Engineers India Limited, ICA, Indian Concrete Institute. He served as VP South, IS Structure E, then Secretary General of ACCE, President of Indian Concrete Institute for the term 2015 and 17, Vice President of Asian Concrete Federation for the years 17 and 18. He has to his credit around 40 papers in national and international journals and conferences. He has been honored with Eminent Engineer Award by Institution of Engineers at their annual convention in 2000. So it's very difficult to brief his complete achievements in short span. So he's a renowned professor in the field of concrete technology and structural engineering. So now I invite Dr. Manmohan R. Kalgal to take up the session. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Professor Ishwar Reddy. I want to now, I think if you can put off your screen, I can put on my screen.
Yeah, I have stopped my sharing, sir.
Okay. I hope you are able to see.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So good morning to all the participants, most of whom I hope are teachers. And I hope in this difficult situation of COVID, you're all taking care and keeping yourself safe and healthy. So when we are talking of our health, we are also now planning to talk in this particular session on the health of the buildings. Now, the title that we have chosen is Condition Assessment of Buildings, Evaluation and Repair Strategies. So I'll briefly take you over this particular topic from a very broad perspective, giving you the total picture, overall picture, so that it will be a kind of curtain raiser for all the other talks by very eminent people whom Professor Ishwar Reddy has organized. So this condition assessment is also called as health check. Just like we do our health check once in a while, building also needs to be checked for its health. So why we do this is for several reasons. One is, as I said, to determine the health status of the structure, whether it is robust, whether it is likely to last for long, and so on and so forth. To apply some corrective measures wherever necessary. Just like when we do our health check, it is first to check whether we are all right. And if there is something slightly wrong or slightly of concern, we would like to go to a doctor and see what needs to be done or what care should be taken in terms of our regular day-to-day life. And the third thing is to also evaluate for the building what is the maintenance regime that we should undertake so that the residual life of the structure is enhanced. So just like again, I will continue to keep giving the analogy of our health versus building health. So when, let us say, we are diagnosed to have something, maybe a diabetes or blood pressure or something, then the doctor will tell us how we should change our lifestyle so that we are able to take control of the situation and live longer. So that is the same thing with the building also. And sometimes, as far as building assessment is concerned, which is not connected to human health, is that we might do this condition assessment to see if there is possibility of changing the use of the structure. The structure might have been built as a residential building. You may want to convert it to a commercial building, may want to remove a few walls, make the hall big, and then take it into a commercial utilization. Or it might, a part of it, you might want to store something, so on and so forth. So it's also possible that you may want to change the use of structure, and hence you may be wanting to see whether it is worthy or possible to do this particular change in the structure and use it for the new application that we are thinking of. It's also possible that you will undertake a condition assessment for a building which you want to purchase, or you want that building to be insured. So the insurance agency would like to check whether the building is robust so that they can insure that building. So these are reasons for which, like even here also I can bring the human analogy. If you want to take a health insurance, the insurance company wants you to have a health check. Only then they will decide whether they can give an insurance to you or they can cover you with insurance, and they will also decide what is the premium. So even in a building, if they want to insure the building, to decide the premium, they would like to know what is its condition and what is its residual life. So condition assessment or health check is done for various reasons. Now, what is it that is involved in a condition assessment? Now, first thing is examination of the structure through comprehensive physical observation. So when you go to a doctor, what does he do? He will first look at you, and then he will probably take the measurement of your heartbeats. He may keep a stethoscope on you, and he may also ask you a few questions. So same thing, we examine the structure through comprehensive physical observations and then carry out relevant probing tests, like what the doctor would do to you. So some tests will be done on the components of the building and constituent materials in the building, and also it might be aided by some supplementary theoretical analysis to see actually what kind of loads and what kind of moments and shear and so on is coming on various parts of the building, and in light of that, whether it is capable of withstanding those or not. So some definitions are definitely required before we go forward. One is the word defect. Now, what is a defect? So one of the definitions that I found suitable was that defect is a flaw which creeps into the structure because of design mistake or poor workmanship or fabrication or construction before it begins its service life. That means you are having some issues at the time of the baby being born. So you would like to know what are these flaws which are built in. And if the building is not maintained, also there was a flaw in it, the flaw has a potential to lead to a failure. So this is called a defect. Now, what is distress? Distress is a collective term for the physical manifestation of problems. So there can be several problems which are inside. Now, these are shown just like body. When it has any problem, the first thing that happens is you get a fever. What does fever mean? Fever means that there is something wrong with the body, and the body is trying to fight by creating or raising the temperature of the body. So the same thing is here. So the manifestation of such problems like cracks, spalling, pop-out, staining, etc., or some signs of corrosion, all of these are symptoms. So distress is a symptom to indicate that there are defects, right? So the third word is deterioration. Now deterioration is what? Obviously the English meaning itself will tell you that it is a gradual loss of the desired performance. So the material properties might have got degraded, or there might be some issues which might be now reducing the strength and service life of the structure. And it is the major thing that you have to remember here is that it is over a period of time. So this is time dependent. So some small types of deterioration may develop early also, like you have shrinkage cracks, which look as if the concrete is now deteriorating. Actually, it's not deteriorating, but it's a symptom which has come at the early life. But then most of these deterioration issues come a little later in its life. So what's the objective of the condition survey? It is to identify the causes of distress and their sources. So the first and foremost objective of the condition survey is to identify the causes of distress. Distress can be for various reasons. As I said, you may get a fever, but it could be various reasons. You may get a headache, it might be for various reasons. Even an upset stomach can create a headache. So you must know what is the source. So the source of the distress or the causes of the distress have to be identified. That's the first objective of a condition survey. And then it is to assess. Now, once we know that there is a distress, we have to find out what is the extent of distress. How much is the distress that has spread in the body of the structure, whether it is localized at one place or the overall structure is suffering and so on. Then once we know that there is a distress, there is a degradation that's happening, we would also like to know what is the strength of the structure. Now, what is residual strength? How long it can withstand? What is the existing structure's strength? Then the third thing is rehabilitability. That is, whether you can rehabilitate or not will depend on what is the distress and how much is the degradation that has happened. So if a man gets into a hospital with a heart problem, they'll see by doing a bypass whether his heart can come back to near normal or at least 50-60% of the normal capability. If it has already lost all its capability and let's say its efficiency has reduced to 20% or 30%, it is not possible to revive that patient. So it may not be possible to do any rehabilitation of a building if the residual life is very less or it is in a very bad shape. So this is the second objective. One is to identify, second is to assess. The third objective of the condition survey is to prioritize which are the elements which are distressed, which is the major distress, which is the one which needs to be tackled first, what is serious, and what needs to be taken up for repairs. So since this entire faculty development program is on repairs and rehabilitation, it's primary importance for us to do this condition survey to decide on the repair and rehabilitation or retrofitting methodologies. So to prioritize which one to do first, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you must do a condition survey. Also, it will help you to select and plan the effective remedy. We will see how we can select some of the possible methods of remedy out of hundreds of possibilities that are there. The condition survey will help you to tell which is the one which you should choose, or which set of repair methodologies you have to choose, and what priority you should start doing the repairs. So the most important thing, as I went on repeating, is to find the cause. Unless you know what is the disease, no medicine can be given. Similarly, we have to first try to find out what is the cause, and then automatically the remedy will be a common sense issue many a times. What we should realize, just like in human body, in the structure, the cause of distress may be, the source may be somewhere else, and the cause of distress may be something else, but what is seen could be a totally different picture. For example, a simple thing like damp patch. A damp patch could be for various reasons, and the origin of this dampness might be somewhere. It may not be just behind the damp patch. It might have traveled from somewhere. It might, unless you arrest that source of the dampness, you will not be doing any good to the structure. So that's the most important thing that we must remember. So it's essential that engineers conducting the condition survey should determine the source or cause of the deterioration so that they can effectively give symptomatic treatment. That is, you give paracetamol to reduce the fever. But at the same time, you must also realize that it is important for us to find out whether the cause is somewhere else and we should deal with that cause. Unless we do that, the whole thing is not comprehensive. So the choice of method and the devices that we use for condition assessment itself depends on several factors. The reasons for the test. Why do you want to do this condition assessment itself? That itself will decide what are the methods that I would like to use and what are the devices that I would like to use. The cost involved, everything costs. So the condition assessment also, how detailed you want to do, how comprehensive should be, will depend on involvement of several engineers, workmen, equipments, and so on and so forth. So it involves the cost. So how much are you ready to evaluate, spend for evaluation? Just like when, again, going back to the human body, the doctor tells you a few tests to be done and every test will cost you. So depending on your financial condition, depending on the priority of the tests that need to be done, the doctor will decide how many tests should be done, which is mandatory, which is optional, and so on and so forth. So the cost involved is an important factor to choose the method and device for condition assessment. The third thing is the accuracy of the estimate. So the accuracy of the estimate again depends on how sophisticated and how detailed is your investigation. So if you want to know very accurately what is the strength of that structure, what is the strength of a particular component, how is the deflection that has come there, is this deflection dangerous, is it going to increase, so on and so forth, you will have to do a much detailed condition assessment and you will get a very accurate result. But suppose you want to say, like in Hindi, they say, mota moti, I want to get an idea. So I want to get a rough idea whether it is okay. Probably a good engineer can just visit the site, look at it without doing any tests, can probably give you a fair estimate of what it is. So the accuracy also decides what is the choice of the method and the device. So the causes of distress can be many, many, many. So it's almost impossible to put a full comprehensive list, but then generally we can categorize them like this. One is the atmospheric effects which cause distress in the structure. It could also be due to the natural aging of the building in the environment that it is there. So the major effects are carbonation, chloride attack, sulfate attack, and so on. I'm not getting into the details of all this, how carbonation affects, how chloride affects. In fact, this afternoon you will be having a wonderful lecture by a very eminent engineer, M.N. Ramesh, who will give you probably all the details and the chemistry that is involved in the atmospheric effects like carbonation, chloride attack, sulfate attack, and so on. But suffice to say, the causes of distress, one of the major possibility is due to atmospheric effects and aging. Second is material contamination. Now the material, when you started using the material itself, if you had not tested properly, there is a possibility that you might have some alkali silica reaction, alkali carbonate reactivity, and so on. The third thing is, at the time of construction, if there were some deficiencies, that also can give you problems or which can cause distress in the buildings. There could be a defective design and detailing. So the design itself might have been defective, that they might not have taken certain load into consideration, or they might have taken the loads in the wrong fashion, or even if the design is done properly, the detailing might not have been done properly. This also can cause distress. It's also possible that although everything is done well, there could be a natural disaster like what is happening now. Nisarga came, before that Amphan came, and there can be cyclones, there can be storms, there can be tsunamis and so on and so forth. There could be a fire accident, or there could be an earthquake, or there could be in some countries even a volcanic eruption. So these are possibilities which might have caused distress in the building. A war, also certain bombings here, there, or probably due to terrorism, some blast here and there would have also caused the distress. So there are many reasons why distress would have occurred. So when we do a preliminary investigation, which is a very, very important part of condition assessment, the goals of the preliminary investigation is to provide an initial information regarding the condition of the structure. So this initial information also tells you what is the type and seriousness of the problems that are affecting the building. It also gives you an idea as to what are the intended rehabilitation techniques that can be applied. You may think of hundreds of rehabilitation techniques, but it might not be feasible to do it in that structure under the condition. Let us say it is an operating office. Now when the operation is on, an operating office or an operating factory, you may not be able to shut down the entire factory and take up rehabilitation. But of course, if it is very dangerous and very, very important, you may have to do it. But otherwise, one of the ideas that you will get from preliminary investigation is the feasibility of performing the intended rehabilitation. It also gives you information on the need of detailed investigation. Now, this preliminary investigation will tell you whether you need to go for a very detailed investigation. ऐसा नहीं चलेगा that you just go and see and you get all the picture. No. So when this preliminary investigation is taken up, because of those objectives that I mentioned, the scope and methodology can involve one or more of the following steps depending on the size and complexity of the project. So the first step is to review the plan, specification, and construction records. Many a times the buildings don't have these plans, specification, and construction records. And even if you have plans, many a times they would have made some changes while doing the construction. So you may not have as-built drawing, as-built material specification, as-built construction records. All right, if you can get at least some plan, specification, and records, to that extent you will be lucky. Once you get that, you must go through thoroughly to understand what kind of a building are you going to visit. Before even going to visit, you must look at these records if available. Then you must go to the site and then start observing the conditions there. It may also be necessary for you to measure some of the geometrical features to say whether it complies with the drawing. Measure some deflections and other things if it is seen. So the deflection won't be in the drawing, so you have to make some measurements to see what is the deflection, whether it is within the limits or not, how many years are over, is it due to short-term deflection, long-term deflection, and so on. If there is some displacement of a foundation or a crack in the wall, you may have to do certain measurements, and all these measurements are for assessing the damage preliminarily. Then you may go also for some non-destructive testing. So there are several non-destructive testing equipments. Dr. Balasubramanian is going to talk about in detail on the non-destructive testing. So you may carry some of these instruments and do some non-destructive testing there. The simplest non-destructive testing equipment, according to me, is a hammer and a chisel. Even that is a equipment. But if an intelligent engineer can get a lot of information from that also. We will look at it in the next few slides. So it's also possible that you may carry a chisel and do some exploratory removal. That is, if you see some stain or something and if you are doubting some corrosion, you may slightly chip off some portion to see what it looks like inside. So that's called an exploratory removal. You're not damaging the structure, but you're doing some small chipping here and there. You may also do some sampling and testing and analysis. So you may take out some materials, send it for test, or you may take out a part of the reinforcement, see whether the diameter has already reduced, and the strength has reduced, and so on and so forth. And you may analyze these samples. The detailed studies are generally not done in the preliminary investigation. They are deferred until a detailed investigation phase is planned. If that investigation is deemed desirable, detailed studies are generally in the next stage. Now, this visual inspection, when you go to the site, is a phenomenally important, data that is given when you go there for visual inspection. What is important is that it is a qualitative method. It's not a quantitative method. Just by looking at it, like some people ask you to go to the site and look at the soil and estimate this bearing capacity. It's not possible. You can only say whether it is good, better, best, or worst. That is a qualitative method. So visual inspection is a qualitative method. It can give you some idea about evaluation of structural soundness, and it helps you to identify the distress symptoms together with associated problems. And it provides valuable information to an experienced engineer. It gives you some idea about its workmanship, structural serviceability, and material deterioration mechanism. What is it that is deteriorating the materials there? So this, an experienced engineer by look can get some idea. It's also meant to give a quick scan of the structure to assess the state of general health. So the record of visual inspection is an essential requirement. It's not that you go there and come back as if you have gone for an excursion. No, everything will have to be recorded. This visual inspection, because memory overlap is there. When you see something else, you will forget what you have seen earlier. So as in when you start looking at it, you should start recording what you have looked at and what you feel can be the cause for the problem. So this will also help you to prepare a realistic bill of quantities for various repair items later. So in visual inspection, it's very important that experienced engineers should carry out the work, because it forms a basis for detailing out the plan of action for the diagnosis and problems. It also quantifies the extent of distress, and it's very important. Now, when I show this on the screen, what is it that you are looking at? So some people will say, I'm seeing some coffee beans. Some people say, I don't know, it could be a mix of several things. Now, there is a difference between seeing and observing. Now, if you closely observe, you will see that among these coffee beans, there is one human face which is hidden there. Now, I don't know how many of you could see it in the first shot. What is trying to be emphasized is that there is a difference between seeing and observing. So an experienced engineer observes. He will not just see and come. So he will know what to look for, where to look for, and how to identify. So that's very important in a visual inspection. So simple tools he will carry, like I said, camera with flash, magnifying glass, binoculars, because he may not be able to reach the place where the distress is. He may carry a crack gauge for measuring the crack width, a chisel and hammer, this is what I meant, as the preliminary NDT equipment, are usually needed. Sometimes, of course, some platform, scaffold, tower, etc. may be required to access the particular place of distress. So visuals tell stories. So an experienced engineer, by looking at the visual distresses, will come to know the stains in masonry, for example. Just I'm taking one or two examples. The stains in the masonry, which you can see in these pictures, can tell you different stories. For example, the first two, what you might be seeing is some alteration, change in color due to deposits of materials, a very thin film or layer of deposit. Now the engineer will automatically, immediately grasp that the possible causes and deficiencies may be, it is a deposit not belonging to the substrate, that like it is a rust, paint, smoke, etc. And he will know that these are not very dangerous to the building, but it only requires a cosmetic treatment. If he sees this, what we call as efflorescence, the formation of white substance on the surface, which is powdery, filamentous, or crystalline, he will know that this is possible due to water flowing through the masonry, or from the backing or from the soil. And again, here he knows that this is not a very dangerous thing. This can be cleaned and it can be continued to. And again, looking at the intensity, he will know whether it requires a detailed repair or just a cleaning and then covering up. Obviously, this will tell people that this is due to moisture because algae have grown, or molds, or plants, or vine have grown. So he knows that moisture is the main criteria, and wet bricks are the ones which are becoming feeding grounds or for ground for the growth of this vegetation. So he will also look for organic growth, whether it is there in other places like stone, concrete, etc. Now this picture automatically, because it's in a basement, a damp patch, changing color, all of this will indicate to him that there is probably a high water table at the back, or water feeding due to some broken pipes, improper waterproofing, and so on. So seeing will give a lot of insight into what could be the issue. If he looks at this kind of scenario, he knows obviously that the maintenance has been absolutely lacking, and hence all of these issues have come. So 99% of these kind of issues are due to lack of maintenance, or it could be due to poor workmanship. Now, poor workmanship could be like this: in a RCC, inadequate cover due to congestion of reinforcement. There are so many reinforcement rods at the bottom that concrete could hardly come in and give a cover to the reinforcement. So obviously the cover fell off. So by looking at this picture itself, he can say that this was a construction deficiency or a defect. Now, when he looks at this kind of scenario, he knows that there was more than required cover at the bottom, very less cover at the side, and obviously this has created corrosion and spalling of concrete. When he looks at a column like this, you can see there are so many stories that are being told, that there is chemical action here, that the cover has spalled off, reinforcement has corroded. You can see that these ties are totally eaten away. There are no ties here and here because of extensive corrosion, significant reduction in the dia of main bars, and so on and so forth. So these cracks in concrete are due to various reasons. I mean, there are hundreds of reasons for the cracks in concrete. So if you were to classify, cracks could be occurring before hardening, or it could be after hardening. And before hardening, it could be plastic stage. When the concrete is in plastic stage, it might have occurred due to shrinkage or settlement, or when it is still not hardened or strong enough, a movement of the formwork or subgrade movement or late jointing might have created cracks. And in the hardening stage, it could be a physical phenomena, it could be a chemical phenomena, it could be a thermal phenomena. All of these can cause cracks. So just by looking at a crack, it's not easy to understand what is the issue, because unless we understand what is the disease, we can't give medicine. Please remember that. So it could be due to drying shrinkage, it could be grazing, sulfate attack, restraint shrinkage. All kinds of problems are possible. Chemically, it could be alkali aggregate reaction, corrosion in reinforcing steel, carbonation, and so on. Due to thermal, it could be again high temperature gradient, shrinkage, etc. Or it could even be structural, overloading, improper design, excessive movement, and so on. So cracks in concrete are the most difficult to understand, handle, and repair. So you can see some photographs which again emphasize a water tank supporting structure, extensive cracking due to bond failure and spalling caused by corrosion. You can see here there was hardly any cover to the reinforcement, so there was corrosion and spalling. You can see here this is a vertical load carrying member like a column. There are cracks here which probably indicate that there is an overstress of this particular column, and column is about to fail. It's also possible that cracks can get compounded due to leakages, like what you can see here in a basement. There is a crack in the retaining wall, and it is also allowing water to come inside. So there are so many structural members, columns, beams, and walls, and so on. So the cracks can be at various places. Fundamental thing to remember is that crack occurs where there is tension. So looking at the position of the crack, the way the cracks have grown, you can understand whether it is a flexural crack or it's a shear crack and so on. All of you being teachers, I don't have to explain this in detail. So you can see a beam with a flexural crack, middle at the bottom growing upwards, a diagonal near the support, which is obviously a shear crack, and so on. So this is a corrosion due to a leaky toilet, a toilet above. You can see the pipes here, which indicate that there is a toilet above this toilet. So it is leaking and it has caused corrosion of the slab reinforcement. This is a typical chemical attack. A factory which has chemical effluents might be corroding the reinforcement at the soffit of the slab. It's also possible that some settlement might have occurred, foundation might have settled. So cracks like this might be seen in a building which is having a foundation, which is having settlement, or more importantly, differential settlement. So this is a typical photograph of a very bad expansion of the soil causing extensive distress. This building is almost worth demolishing rather than repairing. So this is due to swelling of soil, that is Montmorillonite or black cotton soil. So this is a typical photograph of a fire damage. You can see the column, beam, slab, all of them have spoiled. The temperature has gone beyond certain level, so the distresses are seen. One in terms of what has fallen off, the other one is the color of the concrete, which tells you what is the kind of damage that has occurred. So this is again some columns A4, column A3, all of them are, some portion of the concrete is already disintegrated, some cracks have come due to a fire accident. Earthquake, of course, is very difficult to predict, but it is possible to make it somewhat resistant. And the most damaged buildings in earthquake are masonry buildings. So it could be delamination and collapse of walls, diagonal cracks, vertical corner cracks, and total collapse of random masonry, etc. that are possible. These are due to earthquake. So the damages, if they are so bad, probably nothing can be done. But if it is minor, you could look at some kind of rehabilitation even in an earthquake damaged building. So earthquake damages could cause shear failures in the beam, and it can cause total destruction of columns and so on and so forth. So there are two types of distresses or deficiencies. One is called the intrinsic deficiency, which is a design deficiency. That is wrong assessment of design loads, or the effects of shrinkage, thermal movement, structural behavior, etc. are not considered properly. These are intrinsic. That means the disease is already inbuilt in the structure. There are also what are known as extrinsic deficiencies. These are basically environmental effects. So like in physical, it could be heating, cooling, wetting, drying, abrasion. All of these are due to external agencies, but they are causing physical effects on the structure. So this is physical effects, or they are called as extrinsic problems. There could be chemical problems, as I said, chloride attack, sulfate attack, carbonation, so on and so forth. So some of the tests that you can do on concrete, basically, we must remember at the outset that it is almost impossible to obtain a very accurate estimate of the strength of the concrete. Most cases, when we are called to the site, they will say, can you find out what is the strength of the concrete? By just looking at it, it's impossible. Even with the tests also, it is reasonably, or I can say it is definitely not possible to give a very, very accurate prediction of the strength. You can come to a reasonable estimate depending on how detailed is your investigation and what data you have in your hand. The study of the cracking and other damages and detection of voids, this can be made more accurately. The strength of concrete is almost impossible to get 100% accuracy, but studying the crack and other damage detection of voids, etc. can be done fairly accurately with the equipments that we have. So what we should know is the range of tests that are available, the particulars of the limitations that are there in these instruments, and the accuracy that can be achieved is very important. So anybody can take an X-ray of a human body. But to understand what is the problem by studying that X-ray requires an expert. And also, if the X-ray is not taken from the right angle, even the expert may not be able to make out what is the issue. So he should know whether he should go for an MRI, he should know whether he should go for an ultrasound, whether he should go for an X-ray. So it is the specialist who decides depending on the knowledge that he has. But there are a range of tests that can be done on a human being. Similarly, there are hundreds of equipments and hundreds of tests that can be done on a structure. So the limitation should be known. How accurate is this? And what are the cost effects of doing this kind of detailed analysis and so on. So once you know the limitations, then you will not be disappointed later. Because tomorrow, if you are asked to do a test, and if the result turns out to be that you are not so very accurate, there was some 20% error. If you already knew that there can be 20% error, then there is no disappointment. Otherwise, some disillusionment and some fight between the owner and the investigator is likely to be there. So, as I said, non-destructive test, one of the most elementary test is a hammer. So, a good engineer with a rubber mallet or a hammer, he can tap the concrete, and due to the change in the sound of the concrete, can find out whether there is any delamination due to corrosion. Now, when he starts stamping this, he also marks it with a paint so that he will know in which region there is an issue. There is also another method called chain drag sounding. That is, you draw a, when you have a very large area, you draw a set of chains on the surface. Again, by closely hearing what is the sound that is coming due to the chain drag, you can decide where there can be a delamination that might have occurred, which might have caused due to construction deficiency or corrosion. So in non-destructive tests, there are hundreds of equipments, but the most important ones are called as the hammers, that is the rebound hammer. This Dr. Balasubramaniam will deal with in detail. This is an auto recording, rebound hammer. This records on a paper, this records in an equipment, and later can be digital analysis or accumulation of the data. There is what is known as ultrasonic pulse velocity test. The Smith hammer is to find out what is the hardness of the material on which it is being tested, and hence can relate it to a strength to some extent. Ultrasonic pulse velocity passes pulses into the concrete, and by studying the speed or the velocity of the pulse movement, it can find out whether the concrete is dense or not. It will also find out if there are any voids in the concrete or cracks in the concrete, depth of concrete, and so on. There is also what is known as profometer or cover meter, which tells you what is the depth of reinforcement, what is the spacing of reinforcement, and to some extent, what is the diameter of the reinforcement. These are important for us to assess when we don't have any drawing to know what is the strength of that column or member that is there, whether it is slab or whatever. It's also important to know where the reinforcements are, because the pulse velocity test, you should not pass the pulses through the reinforcement. Otherwise, the pulse will pass through the reinforcement and give a false indication that everything is fine. So you should avoid reinforcement when you're testing concrete. There is what is known as half cell potential measurement, which tells you the corrosion activity, how prone it is for corrosion, whether it is likely to be corroding already, it is in a dangerous state, etc., etc. You can find out from this half cell potential meter. You can also take a core of the concrete at places where you have doubt, which gives you a physical view as to what is there in the depth of the concrete. And by testing the core, you can also find out what is the in situ strength of the concrete. You can do a load test of a particular panel to see whether it can take the load. These are all non-destructive tests, and they will not damage the structure. Core test, yes, small cores will be damaging, but then you can always fill it with a very high quality concrete at that particular place. There is also possibility to do some in situ permeability test to know how durable the structure is likely to be. That is, whether the chlorides and such other elements can enter the concrete. Is it permeable or it is highly dense and so on? You can do with some permeability test like torrent tester and so on and so forth. It's also possible to find out the adhesive strength or tensile strength of a surface by using this pull-out test or pull-off test and so on. There are hundreds of tests, mind you. I'm not covering all of them, but I'm just trying to give you a glimpse of what is possible to be used in the preliminary investigation. Of course, the same equipments can also be used for detailed analysis in a very extensive and planned manner. So there can be special tests that you can design also depending on what you want to analyze. Same again, coming back to the analogy of the human being, you are doing certain tests and then you're trying to analyze the whole body. So you must be knowing that there are limitations. If you are testing concrete at one place, you are testing the strength of the concrete at that place. All other places, what is the strength? Most probably it may be the same. So that is what we should keep in mind. So the results of the preliminary investigation should be summarized in a report, which will include structural capacity check, project feasibility, identification of structural problems, strengthening requirements, and needs for further investigation. So just after preliminary investigation, a report should be made. It should have all of this: structural capacity check, project feasibility, identification of structural problems, strengthening requirements, and needs for further investigation. In fact, there is an ACI document on evaluation of structure prior to rehabilitation itself, which is 364.1R. You can go through that. Of course, there are many Indian publications also, like the CPWD Handbook for Repairs, the National Institute of Disaster Management guidelines and so on, which you can use for getting a full idea as to what this entire evaluation of the structural or non-structural issues are. So the structural capacity check generally produces some kind of an idea for us, that is whether the structure or individual members are adequate for the intended use. The structure or individual members are adequated for existing loads but may not be adequated for intended use. That is when you are changing the use of the structure. So it may indicate that the structure or individual members are adequate for existing load but may not be adequate for intended use, which means you have to go for some kind of a retrofitting here. So the analysis is also possible to be inconclusive. You may not be able to draw any inference, but this is one primary aim of the preliminary investigation, to get some kind of an idea about the structural capacity. So depending on the results, the adequacy of the structure must be established. It may also be necessary to propose immediate action to deal with condition affecting safety. Suppose there is something which is in the imminent chance of collapse, you may have to immediately support them and then take adequate action, like probably evacuate the people and so on and so forth. So when it comes to repair strategies, I'm not getting into a very detailed analysis. I need another 5-10 minutes. I hope, because we started at 10:10, I will go up to 11:10. So the roadmap to repair of structures is consisting of the following steps: condition evaluation, determination of the cause of the deterioration, selection of repair materials and methods, preparation of drawings and specifications, bid and negotiation process, execution process, and appropriate quality control measures. See, this is the roadmap for repair. We have done the analysis, evaluation, maybe preliminary and then detailed and so on. After that, when we are planning a repair of the structure, the repair work is based on the following steps: condition evaluation, determination of deterioration, selection of repair methods and materials, because there are hundreds of repair materials and several hundreds of methods also. So whatever is chosen, for that you must prepare drawings and specification. Only when you do a drawing and specification, you can call for a bid. And once the bid is called, he should be clear as to what is involved. He can't be just giving some kind of a bid. And then there should be a scientific negotiation process, not just say, no, no, can you do it at 50% of the cost and so on. You should ask him for a rate analysis, find out whether it is reasonable, and then you must negotiate scientifically and systematically. If you over squeeze, he will compromise on his repair methodology. Then it is just like going to a roadside doctor and quack and getting a medicine instead of going to a specialist. In the long run, you will start paying more than what you could have spent for a specialist. So the execution process, again, you will have to plan all this. There may be some change of occupation to be done. Then there can be some barricading to be done, and so on and so forth. And when this is happening, how do you ensure that appropriate quality control measures are in place? All of this will be there in the roadmap of the repair of structures. Also, at the end of the repair of the structures, you must ask him, or you must make a maintenance manual for after the completion of repair works, what is the minimal maintenance that one should keep to make sure that the building lasts longer. So to select repair materials for concrete, the essential parameters, what do we look for in repair materials? We look for low shrinkage properties, requisite setting and hardening properties, workability, good bonding with substrate. These are possible requirements. Just like when we ask for concrete, we may be looking at various performance parameters. So here are some of the performance parameters that you may be looking for. Compatible mechanical properties and strength to that of the substrate, possibility of allowing relative movement of expected the repair area, minimal or no curing requirement, alkaline characteristics, aesthetics to match with the surroundings, and also it should be cost effective. I'm not saying all of these are the requirements. Some of these or many of these could be the requirements for choosing the material for repair of concrete. So it should of course be durable, non-degradable, and non-biodegradable, and it should be non-hazardous and non-polluting. So the application range, materials for surface preparation, chemical rust removers, all of these are different applications for which different materials are there. There will be passivators for reinforcement protection. There might be bonding agents. There may be structural repair materials. There may be non-structural repair materials, injection grouts, joint sealants, surface coatings for protection of RCC. So depending on application itself, there can be various classification of the repair materials. And these are marketed under different brand names. You can't make out what is what. There is so much of confusion, and there are so many product literature that they give. So the broad classification of these materials is that they are either pre-mixed cement concrete mortars, which are modified with some kind of admixtures or additives, or it could be a polymer latex modified cement additives for mortars, concrete, and slurry, like styrene, butadiene, rubber, polyacrylics, modified acrylics, and so on. Or they could be epoxy resins. They could be chemicals for corrosion inhibition and removal of rust, and so on. So, although they are under different brand names, they are basically under this classification. So the repair methods now, once you've chosen the materials, then the repair methods. Of course, these are interlinked. The repair method decides what material to buy. The material that you have selected depends on the repair method that you have chosen. So the repair methods could be again repair of structural defects to ensure safety of the structure. That is to reinstate structural integrity of the member by restoring and increasing its strength and stiffness. Or it could be for protection of structure from further deterioration. That is prevention of ingress of distress promoting agents like moisture, chloride, carbon dioxide, etc. So that you can improve the durability. Maintaining the aesthetics appearance of concrete surface. And the options are plenty. I mean, again, if I start reading, this will take time. But right from grouting to replacement of concrete to concrete overlays to realkalization to electrochemical methods to waterproofing, most of this will be covered by engineer M.N. Ramesh in the afternoon. So these are the repair options depending on, again, depending on what the disease is, the medicines are many. Medicines come from various companies, right? So same thing applies here also. So rehabilitation strategies might be that you want to reduce the dead and live load. You may repair and strengthen the column beams and slabs. You may want to improve the compressive strength of concrete. You may be wanting to attend to the cracks and joints. These are more in concrete structures, and improving the structure to able to resist earthquake, etc., etc. So these are again some of the strategies of rehabilitation that you may choose, and the repair that might be taken for it. So in conclusion, I would like to say that there are various causes for distress in structures, both intrinsic and extrinsic. That is, it could be internally, the baby may be born with a disease, or it could be get affected by the outside environment. Determination of the cause of distress is very important in adopting appropriate remedy. So unless you determine the cause of distress, don't ever think of doing any remedial measures. There are a number of materials and techniques available, as I mentioned, and for a proper repair strategy, you must plan based on all of this, the data that you have collected, what you want to do, how much you are ready to spend, how critical it is, and what is the benefit of doing these repairs. All of these will be the ones which will decide the repair strategy. So if you don't do it properly, the whole thing might be a waste. You may start redoing the repair once again, which is an extremely costly affair. So for the right solution, we don't have to look or search anywhere. It's right on our head or right in our head. So the best solution is always the most simplest one. So thank you very much for your patience. Over to organizers.
Thank you very much, sir. So I profusely thank Dr. Manmohan R. Kalgal for his valuable lecture on condition assessment of repair works of concrete. So he elaborated on methods of assessment and the NDT testing. So then material selection. So how we need to, what are the specifications for material selection? So then the expertise that is required. So in the condition assessment, so then different repair strategies. So it's a wonderful lecture. I thank Professor Manmohan Kalgal, Dr. Manmohan Kalgal, for his valuable lecture and for sparing his valuable time. So on the account of this FDP on rehabilitation and retrofitting of structures. So now, sir, we'll take questions. So if anybody has any question, you can raise your hand. Sir, here are the questions. So from YouTube Live. So the first question, so how dampness is reduced in a building? Is there an efficient method for removing dampness?
Okay. Dampness could be for various reasons. Dampness coming from the roof, dampness coming through the wall, dampness coming in the basement, dampness rising due to raising dampness, dampness due to broken pipes, dampness due to leakage of water in toilets. There are hundreds of reasons for which dampness is only a symptom. So just like fever, headache, stomach pain, dampness is a symptom that there is something wrong somewhere. Now, the efficiency of the repair or stoppage, the ideal way is to build the structure in such a way that there is no disease, right? The best way is to, breastfeed the baby so that the baby is strong. Just like that, when you do the construction, please try to make sure that all the concrete elements are watertight, all the brickworks is properly plastered and covered, that there is a damp-proof course between the foundation and the wall, and all the pipe fittings are checked for leakages, all the toilets are waterproofed properly in the floor, and so on. So if you could do that, then there will be no problem. But okay, unfortunately, if a problem has come, now one needs to repair the problem. Second is, as you rightly asked, ensure that it doesn't happen again. So for this, it's very important to analyze why this dampness has come and from where this dampness has come. Once you have understood from where the dampness has come, please do the correction at the source. So it is possible that, for example, I just give you one example. Sometimes the water gets in on the slab parapet wall junction. So the slab, there will be some water which will be flowing towards the parapet on its way to the downtake pipe, but there is some stagnation near the parapet junction. So the water enters through the crack or the possibility of the joint between the brick masonry parapet and the slab, goes around the slab, enters the wall which is below, travels through some place and comes out somewhere else. So this dampness has caused from the roof, but it is coming out somewhere near the window in the wall. So you think that the window is leaking, but actually the problem is in the roof. So as I went on repeating, find out the cause of the distress, then you will know what is the remedy. So there is no single remedy for the dampness problem. It's better to avoid rather than try to repair.
Sir, the second question. So after 25 years of age of slab, the top cracks, so then it leaks the water inside the roof. How to treat this?
Okay, so for 25 years, it did not crack or it did not leak. Only after 25 years, it has leaked, which means that the concrete was fairly good. Only later, if it is a roof, probably due to thermal fatigue, which is like expansion, contraction for 25 years. So the concrete was able to withstand all that. Then it said, I'm sorry, boss, I'm not capable of taking this fatigue anymore. And then because of the tension, it cracked. So all that is required is to see what is the intensity of these cracks and what is the extensiveness of these cracks. And you will have to lightly tap and take out the top surface, do a membrane curing preferably, so that the entire surface is covered. When you remove the top surface by light, hammering, chiseling, and also wire brushing, you may see some wider cracks. If some wider cracks are there, please grout them with some grouting methods. And also, if possible, put a mesh, as a thin mesh of nylon or fibers, which is now available, on those major cracks, and then apply the membrane. After applying the membrane, please make sure that this membrane is protected by putting a screed on top, because the membrane might get torn and it might spoil your repair. So this is one very important thing. When you are doing that, also make sure that between the slab and the parapet and the downtake pipe, all those areas are treated in such a way that no dampness enters from anywhere.
The next question, how to control the water leakage from the roof in an effective way?
I already mentioned the same thing now. This is again one major issue that you must remember: do not allow water to stagnate. There should be enough good slope towards the downtake pipes, and the water should flow. 5 minutes after the rainfall, there should be no water on the terrace. So if you can ensure this, 70 to 80% of the problems are solved. Then, of course, these other issues which I mentioned as the answer to the previous question can also be considered.
Yes. So the next question, what are the measures to take to reduce that distress, preparedness?
Now, what are the measures that you took to prevent COVID-19? First of all, you didn't know that there was such a disease called COVID-19 was never anticipated. So it is possible that distress can come from various reasons, including the most unexpected one. That's why I took the example of COVID. But yes, are you not taking care, to avoid yourself from fever, stomach upset, food poisoning, and so on? So you must be careful. One is keep observing. There is also another big branch which I am not covering, which is called as structural health monitoring. So there are various devices that you can use to continuously monitor a structure. It could be a bridge, it could be a building, it could be a tall structure, and so on and so forth. There are methods of structural health monitoring. So that is, it gives you a little more advanced information that something wrong is going to happen instead of suffering after getting the disease. Because like they say, when you get cancer, they will say, no, if you had come a little earlier, I would have cured it. But cancer is such a medicine, such a disease that its symptoms will be seen only after it becomes very difficult to handle. So there are some, like for example, corrosion. Corrosion is like cancer. When you realize that cancer is there, it's already late many a times. So distress is a very general word. I cannot give any formulation or advice as to what should be done to prevent distress. Best thing is build it, design it properly, build it properly, maintain it properly. These three are important to make sure that there are no distresses. If proper design is there, proper construction is there, proper maintenance is there, they should last the design life of 50 years or 60 years or 100 years, whatever. If any one of them is defective or more than one of them is defective, then there will be distress. And that distress depends on what is the problem. So no answer can be given that easily.
So the next question, how to restrict the settlement of existing masonry walls?
Masonry walls generally don't settle. They settle only during its initial time. For example, it can be due to squeezing out of water, or it can be shrinkage of mortar, or due to some loads which are coming during construction time. There may be some kind of a pressure on it. So settlement of wall is generally due to foundation settlement. So the foundation settlement is a separate story. It is a function of the width of the foundation, the bearing capacity, whether there is equal settlement or differential settlement, and so on. So the brick masonry between the layers generally doesn't settle after the mortar hardens. So it is also possible in rare cases that the beam which is resting on the wall might undergo some long-term deflection, and it may press the wall and you may get some cracks, but it's not settlement. Settlement is a phenomena which can happen only when the mortar is soft.
Sir, the next question, which NDT is best among all in assessing the strength of the concrete?
There is no NDT method which gives you accuracy beyond about 60 to 80%. It's inaccurate to an extent of 20 to 40%. So there is no standard method. The best method is to do a core cutting and test the core. That again, as I mentioned, depends on where you take the core and where the strength is needed to be known. For example, if you want to know the strength of the slab, best thing is to do some rebound hammer. The rebound hammer test done from top is sometimes difficult because there'll be screed on it and things like that. Bottom, there will be plaster on it. So if you don't remove the plaster or the screed, you can't get the strength of the slab concrete. So you must first make the surface ready to do this test, and you can't be doing entire slab, you can't be removing the plaster also. So you will do it at some place, assume, and you average out and assume that this is the rebound number. So the rebound is the hardness of the cover concrete, which might be the strength of the concrete inside. This is again a guesswork. So rebound versus strength is again a calibration that you must do, and it can give you an accuracy of up to 80% of the possible compressive strength. But then to get a very accurate strength, probably you may have to do some judicious core testing.
Yes, sir. Next question. So generally we find a crack in parapet wall. So what is the reason?
Crack in parapet wall, vertical or horizontal, it again depends on that. One is the possibility of separation, because there are two dissimilar materials. One is brick mortar, brick masonry. The other one is concrete, which is the slab. So it could be a separation crack due to thermal movements. Concrete expands and contracts differently for a given temperature compared to the brick. So there can be a separation layer. It's also possible that the parapets will develop some vertical cracks and some horizontal cracks due to one end being free and the temperature again acting on it. So there are some, these are harmless. In fact, parapet cracks, no one needs to worry so much. You just need to, grout it or patch it and then replaster it. Please observe in any crack, most important thing is to see whether the crack is growing or the crack is stable. If the crack has come and for next 1 year nothing has happened, you just close the crack. Nothing will happen again. But if the crack is growing, then you will have to make sure why it is growing and find out what is the disease and repair that, then repair the crack.
Sir, the next question. So what are the treatment methods for differential settlements to be arrested?
Differential settlement depends on 2-3 things. One is the extent of difference in the bearing capacities or the settlement that is happening, or whether any new load got added somewhere else which made the differential load transfer that is there, or it is also possible that something might have weakened the soil after this structure was built. So depending on this, the methodologies will change. It's a little difficult to arrest differential settlements in brick masonry foundations or stone masonry foundations. One of the things that is generally done is driving some micropiles so that you densify the soil or confine the soil on the side of the foundation. The biggest problem in building foundation is inside there is flooring. So you can't remove that side. Only the external side of the foundation you can take out. So how do you strengthen the soil is a very difficult issue. But one of the things that is fairly successfully tried is to drive some micropiles around the foundation. If it is an RCC foundation, you can try to see if you can enlarge the size of the foundation by connecting it to a new concrete and hence a wider foot area, so that the bearing capacity, the load comes within the bearing capacity and the settlement reduces. There is Dr. Parlapalli, somebody who's raised
Ramesh.
Yeah.
Ramesh, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So you have given very good lecture, very good information to all the people who are working in the field also, really. Sir, only 2 questions I'm going to posing, sir. One is how to identify the initial stage of corrosiveness of the reinforcement in the concrete by using of NDT test. That is the first one. Then what are the methods to use to prevent that?
Okay, now this corrosion is again, as I said, it is generally called the cancer of concrete. Just like they say, how to determine the onset of cancer in the body, it's very difficult. And the reinforcement is so deep inside, you don't know what's happening there. Yes. The minute the electrochemical cell is set up, the corrosion starts. And once the corrosion starts and the cell is set up, it's very difficult. Of course, there are methods like realkalization and then, depassivating that reinforcement, cathodic protection, and so on. All of this Ramesh is going to deal with, so I have not dealt with that. But yes, like what is the effect of, see, we can only measure the effect. We can't measure or we can't see the corrosion. That's a big problem. there is no X-ray which can tell you that corrosion has started there. So what is done is, once the corrosion starts, the corrosion product being 4 to 6 times the size of the reinforcement, it starts creating tension inside and a delamination starts. If you can, at the very early stage, if you can find out the delamination by doing a thorough ultrasound pulse velocity test, so that you will know that there are some delaminations that have occurred, or if you can do the corrosion potential test, half cell potential test, you will be able to know whether there, and also you can find out whether that particular surface is very impermeable, hence it is probably allowing. One of the big problems today is carbonation. So because of the atmospheric carbonation, a lot of carbon dioxide gets into the concrete, and with the water that is there, calcium hydroxide that's available there, it will form calcium carbonate, and then that will reduce the pH of the surrounding of the reinforcement, and that can start corrosion. So it's difficult. I'm not saying that it's possible. You are lucky if you can find out that there is corrosion fast, but there is no foolproof method which can say the minute corrosion starts, some signal will come. Yes, today they are trying in structural health monitoring kind of situation to put up certain sensors so that any electrical activity in the reinforcement is triggered and you get a warning sign. So this is done in very crucial buildings, but it becomes a costly affair in a normal your house and my house.
So I thank Dr. Manmohan Kalgal for his valuable insights in the field of distress assessment and repair methodologies and material selection. So for his very good suggestions on number of questions that are posed by the participants. I thank you once again, sir. It's a privilege for us to have you on board, sir.
My privilege also. Thanks to all the participants and faculty members. Make sure this is a very interesting subject. Give it as an elective. I have seen many colleges have given this as an elective, and this is a branch of civil engineering where the future students will have a great student job opportunity. In fact, Srinivas Reddy is going to talk about entrepreneurship in the field of repairs. You will realize that there is a huge potential, but we must make sure that our students are informed and ready for taking up that kind of responsibility.
Yeah, sir, I submit to you already.
It's a function of structures. It's a function of chemistry. It's a function of common sense, and so on and so forth. Also legal. So that's why I suggested Srinivas Reddy to you, so that
definitely, sir. Yeah, I submit to you that already we are offering this as an elective course, sir, professional elective.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I thank you once again, sir. So
that students take these electives. See, otherwise there is a tendency. Of course, I was a teacher for 22 years, so I know they will see where they'll get more marks, and that marks will end with the college only. Afterwards, it will not come helpful to them in any of their life. So these are potential areas. Someone has to give a pep talk and tell them that this is a potential area, so that the teacher should be able to attract students to his elective. If you just offer, they will not take.
Yeah, they're taking, and even it is offered for other branches also as open elective also, sir, in our institute.
Very good. Yeah. Yeah, it's a multidisciplinary. You require electronics, you require instrumentation. So it is good to open it for campus elective. Yes.
Yes, sir. So for your information, around 1350 registrations were there, out of which, so today we have on board around 300 participants for your lectures. Okay. So both YouTube as well as Zoom.
Yeah.
So spanning across all industries, I was shocked. So industry people, more number are there, and faculty across all the organizations in the country.
Thank you.
Even abroad also.
All the participants.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, sir. You can stop sharing your